Hey everybody, this is chapter 15 of Raya Dunayevskaya's Marxism and Freedom from 1776 until today. This book is already, there's already a an audiobook of this book on YouTube. What is it? Adrisa's Revolt? Adrestia's. Jesus Christ, I've been saying it wrong. Adrestia's Revolt. Okay. Yeah, but there's one already on Adrestia's Revolt. And there's a. I'm sure there's a. It's a very. I've listened to a lot of their stuff on YouTube, and it's always good. Um, and yeah, so you should look at that if you're interested in that. But I'm only reading the sections of this book that pertain to the Russian question because that's what my research is on as a student. Trotskyist and post-Trotskyist responses. Analyses of the USSR and responses to Trotsky's The Revolution Betrayed. Okay, so the chapter 15 is titled The Beginning of the End of Russian Totalitarianism, so let's get started. 1. East Germany, June 1917-1953. The myth that the Russian totalitarian state is invincible was suddenly and strikingly shattered. On June 17, 1953, the workers in the East German satellite took matters into their own hands on the question of speed up. They moved speedily, confidently, courageously, and in an unprecedented manner to undermine the puppet state. Heretofore, absenteeism and slowdowns were the only weapons used by the workers against the intolerable conditions in the factories, but the struggle reached a new and higher stage of opposition in late spring of 1953. Here is a brief chronicle of the events leading up to June 17th and the days that followed. Beginning with May 18th, the communist government announced a new increase in work hours. The German workers broke out in open strikes. In one effort to stop the strikes, the communist government on June 10th offered concessions on all points except speed up. On the 16th of June, construction workers organized a protest march against speed up from the Stalin Ala housing project. The government sent its supporters to join the marchers, apparently hoping to appear as sponsor, but as the marchers approached the government, joined en route by swelling numbers of demonstrators, the cry had become, quote, down with the zones, down with the government, end quote. The government then admitted it had been doing, quote, wrong, end quote, and issued an order revoking the speed up. It was too late. By the evening of June 16th, the workers had turned the streets of East Berlin into political centers. On block after block, hundreds of people assembled and discussed what to do next. Early on the morning of June 17th, they acted. Columns of strikers charged the main government buildings where the government bureaucrats cowered. Reluctant police moved into prearranged positions. Youth and workers tore down the symbols of communist power, flags, posters, pictures of communist leaders. Despite rifle shots, one young man clambered up the famous Brandenburg Gate and tore down the communist banner. Dispersing on one street and surging up another, the swelling ranks of strikers chanted, quote, we will not be slaves, end quote. For 4 hours, the only power in East Berlin belonged to the workers. They in fact overthrew the East German government. They destroyed the police power, burning barracks, throwing policemen out of windows, and forcing them to flee to the west or to come over to the side of the workers. At 1 p.m., the Russian command marched into Berlin with 10,000 troops and decreed martial law. Street gatherings of more than 3 people were forbidden. The people laughed at the order. At the same time in Jena, strikers from the Zeiss optical factory stormed the Communist Party and communist youth offices and hurled books, papers, typewriters out of the windows and burned them. At the Kodak supplies plant, the workers took over and put strikers in charge. State railway workers walked out, crippling zonal intercommunication and halting the shipment of reparations into Russia. Construction workers cut power cables of both elevated and subway lines and blocked the tracks. 25,000 workers at the Leuna chemical plant, former IG Farben, at Hala, set the plant afire. The workers at the Buna synthetic rubber plant burned it down. These plants were the chief suppliers of gas and tires to the occupation army. The hard coal area of Zwickau was damaged beyond estimate. The demonstrators set fire to huge piles of coal between Halle and Magdeburg. The demonstrators destroyed uranium mining facilities. This is all in italics. They opened prisons and concentration camps to set free the political prisoners. At Gera, an industrial city about the size of Cincinnati near the Russian-operated uranium mines of Saxony, thousands of workers struck and marched on the city prison demanding release of its political prisoners. End italics. Later in the day, 5,000 uranium miners from nearby Ronaberg joined the Gera workers. They threw German police from the windows of their barracks. Russian reinforcements were called. This time they came with tanks. The workers concentrated their angst against the German communist officials who acted as agents of the government. At Ratonov, they killed a factory guard when he tried to stop the strikers from entering the plant. At Erfurt, they hanged 2 red policemen from lampposts. By Saturday, the 20th of June, the Russians had sent 25,000 troops to Berlin from their 300,000-man occupation force at nearby Potsdam. In every major city, Russian power supplanted East German puppet police power. The Minister of Justice was purged. One half of the German police were demobilized as unreliable and sent into the plants to work. In small but significant numbers, Russian soldiers defected to the workers of East Germany as became apparent when the demonstrations subsided and 18 Russian soldiers were speedily executed for mutiny. 20 to 30,000 strikers were jailed, untold dozens were executed, families of convicted strikers were driven from their homes and sent to concentration camps. But on the 22nd of June, the city of Leipzig, showplace of East German communism, was still paralyzed by a general strike. Strikes by the workers in the rest of Eastern Europe followed. The Russian bureaucracy slept uneasily, and Beria, who was directly in charge of the satellites, was to feel it most keenly, for it was the beginning of his end. Above all, it was the regaining of the workers' confidence in the struggle for freedom. The East Germans wrote a glorious page in the struggle, for they answered in an unmistakable affirmative: can man achieve freedom out of the totalitarianism of our age? Even the slave laborers in Vorkuta heard this answer, whereupon they wrote the second page in the new struggle for freedom. One second. I keep saying Beria, and I know who Beria is. He was like an insane person, more or less, in terms of being I'm not exactly sure. Well, I am sure, but I feel like I'm not articulating it well. But I want to look at the Lavrenti Beria's Wikipedia page. Lavrenti, sorry, I'm saying it wrong. Lavrenti Beria, who lived from 1899 to 1953, was a Georgian Bolshevik and Soviet politician, Marshal of the Soviet Union and State Security Administrator-in-Chief, and Chief of the People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs (NKVD) under Joseph Stalin during the Second World War, and promoted to Deputy Premier under Stalin in 1941. Beria officially joined the Politburo in 1946. Beria was the longest-serving and most influential and brutal of Stalin's secret police chiefs, wielding his most substantial influence during and after the war. Following the Soviet Soviet invasion of Poland in 1939. Beria was responsible for organizing purges such as the Katyn massacre of 22,000 Polish officers and officials. Beria would later also orchestrate the forced upheaval of minorities from the Caucasus as head of the NKVD, an act that was declared genocidal by various scholars and concerned Chechens. In 2004, the European Parliament. He simultaneously administered vast sections of the Soviet state and acted as the de facto marshal of the Soviet Union in command of NKVD field units responsible for barrier troops and Soviet partisans, intelligence and sabotage operations on the Eastern Front. Beria administered the expansion of the Gulag labor camps and was primarily responsible for overseeing the secret detention facilities for scientists and engineers known as Sharashkas. After the war, Beria oversaw the Soviet atomic bomb project, which Stalin gave absolute priority to, and the project was completed in under 5 years. After Stalin's death in 1953, Beria became first deputy chairman of the Council of Ministers and head of the Ministry of Internal Affairs. In this dual capacity, he formed a troika with Georgy Melenkov and Vyacheslav Molotov that briefly led the country in Stalin's place. The Gulag system was transferred to the Ministry of Justice, and a mass release of over 1 million prisoners was announced. That amnesty led to a substantial increase in crime. A coup d'etat by Nikita Khrushchev that, with help from former Marshal of the Soviet Union, Georgy Zhukov, removed Beria from power in June 1953. After being arrested, he was tried for treason and other offenses, sentenced to death, and executed on the 23rd of December 1953. Okay. New section. Section 2. Quote, Russia is more than ever full of revolutionaries, end quote. Vorkuta, July 1953. The impulse to organize resistance, which sparked through the slave labor camps in the Siberian waste with Stalin's death, was rekindled by the East German events and burst into an open strike by 10,000 miners in the slave camps of Vorkuta. This was July 1953. 2 Germans, former inmates of the Vorkuta camps, Dr. Joseph Scholmer and Brigitte Gerland, have told the story of those heroic days. They were 2 of the several thousand German inmates who had suddenly been amnestied for the show at the Big Four Ministries Conference in Berlin, January 1953. 1954. What the hell is that? It says the Berlin Conference of 1954 was a meeting of the, quote, Big Four, end quote, foreign ministers of the United States, John Foster Dulles, Britain, Anthony Eden, France, Georges Bidal, and the Soviet Union, Vyacheslav Molotov, from 25th of January to 18th of February 1954. Quote, back to the text, quote, you all seem to be so skeptical about the chances of a revolution in Russia. I am not sure myself, but believe me, Russia is more than ever full of revolutionaries, end quote. Thus, Brigitte Gerland addressed her co-journalist attending that conference in 1954. Brigitte Gerland. I have to go to the German Wikipedia. It says Brigitte Gerland was a German journalist who reported from her own experience about forced labor in the Soviet Vorkuta labor camp. Thus, Brigitte Gerland addressed her co-journalist attending that conference in 1954. Gerland's audience was very skeptical because she was not telling a tale of woe but of revolt. Gerland would have found sympathetic listeners had she engaged in an abstract discussion of whether a revolt can occur under a police state, but not whether she related that one has happened. Prior to June 17th, the preparations for resistance to the totalitarian rulers were based on the eventualities of war, and the slave laborers looked to the Western rulers. When Stalin died in March 1953, hope spread through the camps, but all that came from the Eisenhowers and the Churchills were condolences to the Russian leaders who continued the Stalin regime. Gloom spread throughout the slave labor camps until the June 17th revolt in East Germany showed that liberation can be achieved only by the workers themselves. The Russian political prisoners followed up with their revolt. Here is how Dr. Scholmer, who had actually participated in the strike, described it, quote, "A strike of more than 10,000 miners lasting for several weeks with all the usual paraphernalia, strike committee slogans, pamphlets, and, of course, blacklegs, a strike similar in every respect to that other historic strike in the Lena Goldfields Company mines in Siberia in 1912, when the Tsar's police fired into the strikers just as the communists were to do in 1953. End quote. Nothing shows the uncertainty and insecurity of these totalitarian rulers, armed to the teeth with all the power and terror in their hands, as the caution with which the government at first dealt with the strike. They sent a commission headed by General Derevianko to fly to the camp, where Derevianko tried to harangue the prisoners and failed. The commission returned to Moscow with the demands of the prisoners for a review of all their cases and the removal of the barbed wires. In the end, the Kremlin did what the Tsar had done back in 1912. The Kremlin opened fire on the unarmed strikers, killing 64 and wounding some 200. But they could not put back what the strikers had destroyed, the myth of invincibility. The prisoners without any rights had dared to strike. The prisoners held out for weeks, shaking the Kremlin to its very foundations. Despite total censorship, the workers in Leningrad knew at once of the strike. A few months after, students from Leningrad Mining Institute, working in the pits in Vorkuta, told the prisoners how everyone had talked of the strike in Leningrad. Quote, "We soon got to know where you were on strike. The drop in coal was noticeable at once. We don't have any reserves. There's just the plan, that's all, and everyone knows how vulnerable plans are. It destroyed the myth that the system was unassailable." End quote. On the Western, quote, experts on Russia, Dr. Scholmer had this to say, quote, "When I first mentioned the word, quote, civil war, end quote, to these people, they were appalled. The possibility of a rising lay outside their realm of comprehension. They had no idea that there were resistance groups in the camps." ... Continuing the quote, "I talked to all sorts of people in the first few weeks after my return from the Soviet Union. It seemed to me that the man in the street had the best idea of what was going on. The, quote, experts, end quote, seemed to understand nothing," end quote. Asked what were the motives of the strike, Dr. Scholmer said, quote, "Oh, they were fantastically mixed. Some wanted a little better living and working conditions. Others were hoping for a, quote, new era, end quote, now that Stalin was dead. Some wanted to imitate the 17th of June in Germany, which we had heard described over Radio Moscow and in Pravda. Others wanted to destroy the system, and there was an old man in my barracks who cried over and over again, quote, 'Have we torn down the barbed wire fence yet?' End quote. 'Is it down? Is it down?' End quote, end quote. No. The barbed wire has not been torn down, and freedom from Russian totalitarianism was not won by the East German revolt either. But two new pages in history were written. Whoever before June 17th had heard of a mass revolt against a totalitarian dictatorship? Whoever had before July heard of slave laborers forcing concessions from a police state? 2 pages in history that have shown the way to freedom. That is why the former inmates speak not so much of suffering as of revolt, of freedom, not yet, quote, not yet, end quote, they too say, and go back to, quote, the great Russian poet Pushkin, who, back in 1827, wrote to his imprisoned friends, quote, "Deep in the Siberian mine, keep your patience proud. The bitter toil shall not be lost, the rebel thought unbowed. The heavy hanging chains will fall, the walls will crumble at a word, and freedom greet you in the light. and brothers give you back the sword. End quote. Section 3, Hungary, 1956, Freedom Fighters. All right. Hungary, 1956, Freedom Fighters. Quote, Russian soldiers go home, end quote, became the central rallying slogan of the Hungarian Revolution, which broke out on Tuesday, October 23, 1956. It followed the Polish revolt of the previous week. It was distinguished from the previous revolts by the greater depth, the uncompromising stand, and the involvement of the whole population. As in all popular revolts, the soldiers came over to the side of the people. The freedom fighters of Hungary embraced all layers of the population, workers, youth, and women, the old and the very young. They united behind a common cause to rid themselves of their Soviet oppressors or to die in the attempt. Children from 12 to 16 years of age were seen with rifles and Tommy guns slung over their shoulders and hand grenades in their pockets. They destroyed Soviet tanks by diverting the attention of the gunners to the rooftops, then dashing in under the elevated guns to throw gasoline over the tank and set it afire. Others led the tanks down nearer streets where they were ambushed and unable to turn around. One 13-year-old veteran of this kind of fighting was asked where they learned to do these things. She said, quote, all of us kids were trained in the party, end quote. The attempts of the workers to seize oil fields, rail centers, steel factories, and means of communication, and to run these by revolutionary committees, that is to say, workers' control of production, is the true sign of the attempts of this revolution to effect a total change. A general strike tied up all railroad transport as well as most production. Death and starvation stalked the streets of Hungary as the rebel radio station sent out its last SOS, quote, we are quiet, not afraid. Send the news to the world, end quote. The news to the world about 5 days of freedom revealed more than courageous fighting. It showed that the idea of freedom cannot be killed. That idea does not float in heaven. People live by that idea. Overnight, the one-party system disintegrated and the various political parties appeared along with small newspapers and radio stations. Hundreds of local and distinct organizations, from the Hungarian Revolutionary Youth Party to old parties, including including both smallholders and social democrats, appeared. So total was the wrath of the people against Russian communism that the Hungarian Communist Party tried to appear in a new guise. The temporary party puppet leader, János Kadar, organized it as the, quote, Socialist Workers Party, end quote, but no one took that seriously. Let's look at János Kadar, who lived from 1912 to 1989, was a Hungarian communist worker and the general secretary of the Hungarian Socialist Workers Party, a position he held for 32 years. Declining health led to Kadar's retirement in 1988, and he died in 1989 after being hospitalized for pneumonia. Kadar was born in Fiume, in poverty to a single mother. After living in the countryside for some years, Kadar and his mother moved to Budapest. Kadar joined the Party of Communists in Hungary's youth organization, KIMSZ, and went on to become a prominent figure in the pre-1939 Communist Party, eventually becoming first secretary. As a leader, he would dissolve the party and reorganize it as the Peace Party, but the new party failed to win much popular support. After World War II, with Soviet support, the Communist Party took power in Hungary. Kadar rose through the party ranks, serving as Interior Minister from 1948 to 1950. In 1951, he was imprisoned by the government of Matyas Rákosi, but was released in 1954 by reformist Prime Minister Imre Nagy. I think that's how you pronounce that name. It looks like Nagy. I think it's Nagy. I'm not sure. It might be Nagy. On the 25th of October 1956, during the Hungarian Revolution, Kadar replaced Erno Gero as general secretary of the party, taking part in Naj's revolutionary government. A week later, he broke with Naj over his decision to withdraw from the Warsaw Pact. After the Soviet invasion of Hungary, intervention in Hungary, Kadar was selected to lead the country. Kadar ordered Naj to be executed shortly after coming to power. Kadar was gradually moderated, releasing the majority remaining prisoners of this period in an amnesty in 1963. Kadar's leadership was characterized by unrelenting realpolitik. For a long time, he successfully maneuvered between Moscow's wishes, local interests, and expectations of the Western world. In an interview with a Western journalist, he called himself a, quote, toiler for compromise, end quote. Kadar was succeeded by Karly Gross as General Secretary on the 22nd of May, 1988. Gross would only serve a year in this post due to the fall of communism in Europe in 1989. Despite his time as leader of Hungary, Kadar pushed for an improvement in standards of... During his time as leader of Hungary, Kadar pushed for an improvement in standards of living. Kadar increased international trade with non-communist countries, in particular those of Western Europe. Kadar's policies differed from those of other communist leaders such as Nicolae Ceausescu, Enver Hoxha, and Wojciech Jaruzelski, all of whom favored more orthodox interpretations of Marxism, Leninism. Kadar's reformist policies and the increasing commercial ties to the Western world would in turn worsen relations with Leonid Brezhnev and the Soviet Union. As the leader of Hungary, Kadar attempted to liberalize the Hungarian economy with a greater focus on consumer goods and what would become known as goulash communism. Back to the text. Indeed, it was the same old communism which, while promising withdrawal of the Russian troops and a different way of living, was conspiring to bring back the Russian tanks and troops in force. The first news to the world was about 5 days of freedom from Russian tyranny and from the Hungarian communist, barbaric 10,000-man secret police. And then, the news that the wrath of a people in arms was being stifled by a force of 4,500 Soviet tanks, crack paratroops, MVD, storm guards, and 250,000 of Russian infantry. Yet this massacre of the daring young freedom fighters had not crushed the revolt. After a full week of fighting, their uranium mines were blown up. Their workers were still out on general strike, and there was neither transport nor production. The Hungarian people were choosing death rather than accept Russian totalitarianism. Even the cynics who thought it wishful thinking for anyone to analyze the East German revolt of 1953 as the beginning of the end of totalitarianism began to look to Hungary with non-cynical hope. Many thousands fled, and every reactionary with our own Congressman Walter of the infamous Makarin-Walter Act, our Congressman Walter of the infamous Makarin-Walter Act at the head tried to ride on the bravery of the Hungarian revolutionaries, but the impact soon overrode these hangers-on. The whole brunt of the fight shifted back inside Hungary itself. When all said that everything was over, the Hungarian Workers' Council sprung up. Production remained the key, and the whole brunt of the struggle against Russian tyranny was borne by the workers. They began to fight in the factories, which they were using as their places of refuge. The leaders of the workers' councils were arrested only after they led the factory and walked to the parliament building to negotiate. The workers evolved new ways of fighting, both on the job and when they walked out on strike. For example, the miners refused to mine coal while the Russian army remained in Hungary. Nor did they let anyone else mine the coal, quote, for the workers, end quote. When Russian might finally asserted itself through overwhelming force, the workers blew up the mines. The revolutionary forces now unloosed cannot be overcome by sheer force. They have been forced underground, but they have not disappeared. Nor was the impact exhausted within the national boundaries of Hungary. Thousands of Communist Party members all over Western Europe began tearing up their membership cards. Ever since the end of World War II, the Western European people, veering sharply against the private capitalism that they knew and hated because it had brought them 2 world wars in one lifetime, had turned to Russian communism, literally by the millions. Many now see Russian communism as but another name for state capitalism. The tearing up of communist membership cards is the first step. is a first step that was not taken in 1953 during the East German Revolution, nor just a few months previous to the Hungarian Revolution of 1956 during the Polish Revolt, although the slogans during the latter were almost identical, quote, "Down with this phony communism," end quote, and, quote, "We want bread and freedom," end quote. It was taken only when the revolution was such a thoroughgoing one that it turned both against Russia and the satellite communist regime in Hungary. This Western beginning may not yet reflect the deep and continuous unrest in Poland, but it is a first step in the disintegration of the mass communist parties in Western Europe. It is a beginning only, but it is a beginning. The end. Thanks for listening, everybody.